Hello and welcome to Chapter 4 of Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. This chapter is called How the Commerce of the Towns Contributed to the Improvement of the Country. The growth in riches of the manufacturing and commercial towns contributed to the improvement and cultivation of the country in three major ways. Way number 1, by providing a market for the rude produce of the country. This not only applied to the countries nearby where the town was situated, but to all countries with which the town had commerce. Way number 2. Wealth acquired by those in the town was often used to purchase land in the country which was going on uncultivated. Merchants, growing wealthy in the town, often had the desire to eventually move into the country and become country gentlemen. And when they did, they became the best of all improvers of the country. This is because a merchant was accustomed to employing his money towards profitable projects, whereas the typical country gentleman was used to just spending their money on expenses. And last but not least, way number 3. The success of the towns eventually led to improved order, security, and liberty in the country. And this will be one of the main points of this chapter. Thirdly and lastly, commerce and manufactures gradually introduced order and good government, and with them, the liberty and security of individuals among the inhabitants of the country, who had before lived almost in a continual state of war with their neighbors and of servile dependency upon their superiors. This, though it has been the least observed, is by far the most important of all their effects. In a country which has no foreign commerce or finer manufactures, the wealthy may have no other avenue to spend their wealth than to throw, basically, gigantic parties with thousands of people. And Smith gives a few examples of this. And through some of these specific examples that Smith does give, you get a little more insight into the historical value of the book that I think a lot of you who are reading the book along with my summaries for the main points, would agree that that is definitely another additional value to reading The Wealth of Nations. Smith describes the relationship dynamics between the occupants of the land and the land proprietors, or you can call them feudal lords, as such. A tenant at will who possesses land sufficient to maintain his family for little more than a quit rent is as dependent upon the proprietor as any servant or retainer whatever, and must obey him with as little reserve. Such a proprietor, as he feeds his servants and retainers at his own house, so he feeds his tenants at their houses. The subsistence of both is derived from his bounty, and his continuance depends upon his good pleasure. The authority of these proprietors had roots in the ancient barons, who necessarily became the judges in peace and the leaders in war. The ancient barons, not the king, were the ones capable of mobilizing forces. No other persons had sufficient authority to do this. The king in particular had not. In those ancient times, he was little more than the greatest proprietor in his dominions, to whom, for sake of common defense against their common enemies, the other great proprietors paid certain respects. The king, in this way, actually maintained a precarious position. He was actually therefore obliged to leave the administration of justice in his kingdom to those who had the power to actually administer it, and for the same reason, leave the command of the country militia to those the militia would actually obey. Now, it would be a mistake to consider this as the result of feudal law. In fact, feudal law, if anything, was an attempt to decrease the power of the proprietors in favor of the king. However, feudal law can only do so much when the root cause of these power dynamics is not dealt with. After the institution of feudal subordination, the king was as incapable of restraining the violence of the great lords as before. They still continued to make war according to their own discretion, almost continually upon one another, and very frequently upon the king. And the open country still continued to be a scene of violence, rapine, and disorder. But what feudal institutions were powerless to prevent, manufacturing and foreign commerce eventually brought about. and frankly in a pretty hilarious way. Manufacturers gave these powerful proprietors somewhere to spend their money that was entirely and gloriously selfish. All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. And so, by spending a lot of money on luxuries and general shopping, things for their house, things for them, manufacturers, the great proprietors declined in spending money on the very thing that was the source of their power, other people. And so as personal manufactured expenses increased, money spent on maintaining their subordinates declined. Inhabitants of the land had to be reduced to only the very necessary for basic land cultivation, and an imperfect land cultivation at that. And the proprietors, hoping to continue this cycle, were incentivized to increase rent, to which the inhabitants would only agree if their possession was secure enough for a number of years in order to secure their profit, and the landlord's expensive vanity was such that they were willing to accept such a condition, and thus we have the origin of long leases. And these long leases, which we discussed in a previous chapter, obliged these tenants to not be obligated to do any service to their landlord that was outside of the lease, and thus increased their independence and their power, and then by default decreased the power of the landlords. These changes brought about a new paradigm in which these great landowners were no longer able to disrupt the greater peace and terrorize their neighbors. A regular government was established in the town as well as the country, with neither being more capable of disrupting one than the other. And in this new order, public happiness was oh so greatly increased. And, very notably, it was the result of individuals simply pursuing their own self-interest. A revolution to the greatest importance to the public happiness was in this manner brought about by two different orders of people, who had not the least intention to serve the public. To gratify the most childish vanity was the sole motive of the great proprietors. The merchants and artificers, much less ridiculous, acted merely from a view to their own interest, and in pursuit of their own peddler principle of turning a penny wherever a penny was to be got. Neither of them had either knowledge or foresight of that great revolution which the folly of the one and the industry of the other was gradually bringing about. And so it was that the cultivation of the country in Europe occurred not only unnaturally after, but even as a result of the development of the town, or specifically the development of manufacturing in the town. As you might remember from previous chapters, the natural order of development should be first the country and then the town or city. But due to the particular institutions or nuances of history within Europe, this natural order of things actually played out entirely backwards. And Smith again points to the colonies in North America. We're just doing things better. And thus concludes Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I would ask if anyone's interested in Book 4, but you guys have already told me, and the answer is yes. So if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment. And thank you so much to our Patreons. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.